The classroom was buzzing with noise as students shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. It was an ordinary day in Professor Harris' advanced mathematics class, where he loved to challenge his students with problems that even some university professors struggled with. On this particular day, he turned to the chalkboard and wrote out an equation so long and complicated that several students groaned aloud. It was a problem involving integrals and complex variables, something that would take even the sharpest minds quite some time to solve. Professor Harris adjusted his glasses and looked around the room with a sly smile. "Who wants to give this one a try?" he asked, knowing very well that no one would step forward. Students avoided his gaze, some chuckled nervously while others muttered about how impossible the problem looked. Then his eyes landed on Sarah. She was a quiet woman who always sat in the back of the classroom taking notes silently and rarely speaking up. Most students hardly noticed her, and some even thought she was shy to the point of invisibility. Professor Harris tilted his head and said, "Sarah, why don't you give this a shot?" The room erupted with laughter as students exchanged glances, expecting her to freeze under the pressure. Even Sarah herself looked uncertain as she adjusted her notebook and slowly stood up. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes showed a calm determination that few had ever noticed before. She walked to the board with slow, careful steps while whispers spread through the room. "She is going to embarrass herself," one student whispered. "This is going to be hilarious," another chuckled. But Sarah did not seem to hear them. She picked up the chalk, studied the equation for a moment, and then began writing. Her movements were steady and precise, her handwriting clear as she worked through each step. At first the students kept whispering and snickering, but gradually the sound faded as they realized she wasn't hesitating. Every number she wrote connected perfectly to the last. Every symbol she added seemed to cut through the confusion like a knife. Professor Harris leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk, his eyes widening with each step Sarah completed. The room grew so silent that the only sound was the chalk tapping against the board as she continued with confidence. Lines of the solution filled the space, quickly flowing in a way that seemed effortless for her. The same students who mocked her minutes ago now sat in stunned silence, watching her uncover layer after layer of the equation. By the time she reached the final step, Sarah paused only briefly before writing the exact solution at the bottom of the board. The chalk stopped moving. The answer was correct. A silence heavier than any before fell over the room as everyone stared at the board, then at Sarah. Her face was calm, her hands no longer trembling as she turned to face the stunned class. Professor Harris' mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He finally managed to whisper, "Incredible." The students blinked, some leaned forward in disbelief, others exchanged looks of pure shock. They had expected her to fail, to stumble, to prove that she did not belong. Instead, Sarah had done what none of them could do with ease that looked almost unreal. Would you like me to continue this story into how the class reacts to Sarah after this moment and how her life in the university begins to change? The silence in the classroom stretched on as Sarah quietly set the chalk back down on the ledge of the board. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the shocked stares of her classmates, though she said nothing. For the first time since the semester began, all attention was on her, not because of a mistake or hesitation, but because of the brilliance they had just witnessed. Professor Harris cleared his throat and stood from his desk, his voice carrying a tone of disbelief mixed with respect. "That was flawless, Sarah, every step precise, every calculation exact." The students exchanged stunned glances and whispers broke out again, this time not with mockery, but with awe. "Did you see that?" one of them murmured. "She solved it faster than anyone could," another whispered, shaking his head. Sarah returned quietly to her seat, her expression calm, though inside her heart raced from the weight of so many eyes on her. She pulled her notebook closer as if nothing unusual had happened, but the energy in the room had completely shifted. Professor Harris walked slowly back toward the board, studying her solution again, as if he still could not believe it. He turned back to the class, his voice firm and serious. "I hope you all realize what just happened here. You just witnessed something remarkable." Several students nodded, though many still looked stunned, unable to fully process what they had seen. One student named Mark, who was usually the loudest in the room, leaned forward and whispered to his friend, "I thought she never spoke up, but she just made us all look like beginners." His friend only nodded, still staring at Sarah with wide eyes. From that moment, the way the class looked at her changed. Instead of ignoring her or dismissing her as quiet and unnoticeable, they now glanced her way with curiosity and even respect. Some of them wanted to know how she had done it, how she could take such a terrifying equation and solve it as if it were simple. But Sarah kept her focus on her notes, her calm demeanor never wavering even as whispers of admiration filled the air. Professor Harris finally turned to her again. "Sarah, would you be willing to explain your process to the class?" All eyes turned back to her again, waiting to see what she would say. "Would you like me to continue with how Sarah explains her method and how the class reacts to her teaching?" Sarah looked up from her notebook, her calm eyes meeting Professor Harris' gaze for a brief moment. She gave a small nod, then rose from her chair and walked back to the board with quiet confidence. The chalk felt light in her hand as she faced the blank space beside the equation she had already solved. She turned slightly to the class, her voice soft but steady. "It looks complicated at first, but the key is to break it down into smaller patterns," she said. She drew a clean line on the board, then wrote the first step slowly and carefully, making sure each number was clear. Her classmates leaned forward in their seats, some of them even lifting their pens ready to copy her explanation. The room that had been filled with whispers moments before was now silent, but this time it was a silence of focus and respect. Sarah explained how she spotted the relationship between certain terms, then how she applied a simple substitution to reduce the problem. As she spoke, her words flowed smoothly, without hesitation. Even Professor Harris stood still, watching her work with an expression that showed both admiration and surprise. A student in the back raised his hand hesitantly. "How did you notice that pattern so quickly?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Sarah paused only for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Because I practiced breaking down problems like these when I studied alone. It helps me see through the noise." Gasps and murmurs filled the room again, but this time they carried no mockery, only astonishment. Mark, who had whispered earlier, leaned forward, his eyes wide. "I never would have thought of that," he muttered almost to himself. Sarah continued writing step after step, showing how each piece connected until the solution unfolded again with perfect clarity. When she set the chalk down the second time, she looked back at the class, her face calm as ever. "This is why equations that look impossible are not really impossible," she said softly. "They just need patience and a different way of seeing." The class erupted in a wave of admiration. Several students even clapped, though it started awkwardly at first until the sound grew louder, filling the room. Professor Harris joined in his applause, genuine and strong, his face lit with pride. Sarah simply stepped back to her seat, her quiet presence unchanged, though her classmates now looked at her in a way they never had before. "Would you like me to continue with how Sarah classmates approach her after class and how her quiet brilliance begins to change their perception of her completely?" As Sarah sat back down, the sound of the applause slowly faded into a hushed buzz of voices. Her classmates leaned toward each other, whispering, not in mockery this time, but in amazement at what they had just seen. Some glanced at her with new respect, their eyes no longer dismissive, but curious and thoughtful. Professor Harris cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, clearly still processing what had just unfolded. "Well, Sarah," he said slowly, "I must admit, I thought I was presenting an equation beyond the level of this class, but you not only solved it, you taught the solution better than most teachers could." Sarah gave a small, polite nod. "Thank you, Professor," she replied softly. Her calm tone carried no arrogance, only sincerity, and it left an impression stronger than any boast could have. When the lecture ended and the bell rang, students gathered their notebooks, but instead of rushing out of the room, they drifted toward Sarah. Mark approached first, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by an awkward smile that was incredible, he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I never thought you were so good at math." Sarah looked at him with the same quiet composure. "Thank you, Mark," she replied gently. "I just like solving problems." Another student, a girl named Emily, leaned forward with her notebook. "Could you maybe show me how you spotted those patterns? I want to learn too." Sarah agreed with a small smile, and within minutes a small group had gathered around her desk. She explained patiently how she trained herself to see structures in equations, how she treated each problem like a puzzle instead of a wall. Her words were simple, easy to follow, and filled with quiet confidence that drew everyone in. Professor Harris watched from the doorway, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He could see the shift happening right before his eyes, the quiet student once overlooked now becoming the center of attention, not because she demanded it, but because her brilliance spoke louder than anything else. As the group around her grew, Sarah remained calm and kind, answering every question with the same patience. It was clear that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Would you like me to continue with how Sarah's growing influence in the classroom begins to change even Professor Harris' teaching methods, and how her quiet strength starts inspiring others beyond the class? Professor Harris returned to his desk the following week with a different energy than before. Instead of standing tall and distant, he leaned forward with his hands resting on the podium, his eyes searching the class. "I want to try something new today," he said, and for the first time his voice lacked its usual sharpness. He turned to Sarah. "Sarah, would you be willing to walk us through your thought process on this next equation?" The class turned to look at her, waiting in silence. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded softly. "Yes, Professor," she said, and walked to the board. The chalk felt familiar in her hand as she wrote the long expression across the surface, breaking it down step by step as she explained. Her voice was steady, not rushed, each explanation clear and precise. The students leaned in, scribbling notes not just on the solution but on the way she approached the problem, as if she was opening a door none of them knew existed. By the end of the lesson, even Professor Harris was nodding slowly, his arms crossed, but with a faint smile forming on his face. "Very well done, Sarah," he said quietly, almost to himself. After class, Emily caught up with Sarah again. "You know," she said, "your way of teaching makes so much sense. I feel like I'm actually understanding math for the first time." Sarah gave a small smile. "I just try to look at the patterns," she answered softly. "Everyone can see them if they know where to look." Mark joined in, still carrying his notebook. "I think I need your help too," he admitted sheepishly. "I don't want to fall behind." Sarah agreed without hesitation, and soon what started as one or two classmates staying behind turned into a group that filled half the classroom after lessons. Sarah sat among them, not standing above anyone but side by side, drawing diagrams, simplifying steps, and encouraging them whenever they stumbled. Word began to spread beyond the classroom. Students from other classes started slipping in, quietly sitting at the back just to hear her explanations. Even Professor Harris noticed the change, the once restless group of students now eager, focused, and motivated, and all because of the quiet girl who used to go unnoticed. Sarah never sought recognition, but it was becoming impossible for anyone to ignore her presence. The halls buzzed with whispers of the quiet genius who made math feel alive. And though Sarah continued to move through her days with the same calm humility, her influence was beginning to ripple far wider than she ever imagined. Do you want me to continue showing how Sarah's quiet brilliance starts reaching beyond her university walls, perhaps drawing attention from people outside the classroom? Soon Sarah's quiet gatherings after class began to outgrow the small classroom. Students were sitting on the floor, in the aisles, leaning against the walls, even standing by the windows just to listen to her break down complicated equations. What amazed them most was not only her knowledge, but the way she made every person feel like they could understand the subject no matter how lost they had been before. One evening, Professor Harris lingered outside the classroom, listening unseen as Sarah patiently explained a concept to a struggling student. Instead of frustration, she offered encouragement, reminding him to slow down, to look at the steps rather than the whole intimidating equation at once. The boy nodded, and his face lit up when he finally solved it on his own. Professor Harris felt a strange tug in his chest, something he had not felt in years, respect mixed with humility. The next morning, he asked Sarah to meet him in his office. She walked in nervously, clutching her notebook, not sure why she had been called. He motioned for her to sit, and then cleared his throat. "Sarah," he said, "I have been teaching for decades, and in all my years, I have rarely seen someone with your gift. You not only understand mathematics, but you inspire others to understand as well." Sarah lowered her eyes. "Thank you, Professor," she said softly. "I just want to help." He nodded slowly and leaned back in his chair. "I think you should consider leading a workshop for the university, not just for this class. I believe many could benefit from what you have to share." Sarah blinked in surprise, unsure if she had heard correctly. "A workshop," she repeated. "Yes," he said with a small smile, "you have a way of teaching that even I envy. It is time others see what you can do." The news spread quickly across campus. By the end of the week, the lecture hall where Sarah was scheduled to speak was filled beyond capacity. Students from every department crowded and curious about the quiet woman who had turned an ordinary math class into something unforgettable. As Sarah stepped onto the stage, her hands trembled slightly, but when she saw the eager faces waiting for her guidance, her nerves began to fade, replaced by the same calm focus that always carried her when she solved equations. This was no longer about proving herself to anyone. This was about sharing what she loved. And as she began to speak, the hall fell into complete silence, every eye fixed on her, every word hanging in the air as if it held more weight than numbers on a page. The quiet woman had found her voice, and it was stronger than anyone had ever expected. "Do you want me to continue showing how Sarah's workshop begins to attract attention from people outside the university, perhaps drawing interest from the media or well-known mathematicians?" As Sarah continued speaking, the audience leaned closer with every explanation. She walked through equations that once seemed impossible and turned them into simple steps that anyone could follow. Even students who had failed math before began nodding their heads in understanding. Whispers spread across campus about the woman who made math feel like a story instead of a struggle. Within days, other professors stopped by her workshops, curious to see if the rumors were true. To their surprise, they found themselves taking notes just like the students. Professor Harris sat quietly in the back row, watching her with a mix of pride and disbelief. He knew he had underestimated her from the start, and now he was witnessing her transform not only the students, but the culture of the entire department. One afternoon, a journalist from a local paper visited the university after hearing about Sarah's workshops. She listened carefully to Sarah's explanations and afterward asked for an interview. Sarah hesitated at first and used to attention, but eventually agreed. The article was published under the headline "The Quiet Genius Who Teaches with Heart," and it spread quickly beyond the campus. Soon, professors from other universities were contacting her, asking if she would consider giving lectures or hosting seminars. Sarah was overwhelmed, but she stayed true to her calm and humble nature. She never raised her voice, never rushed her answers. She only focused on making sure every person felt seen and capable of learning. As the weeks passed, more and more people began attending her sessions until the small lecture hall could no longer hold them. The university arranged for Sarah to use the main auditorium, one of the largest spaces on campus. On the day of her first session there, the seats were filled long before she arrived. Students, professors, parents, and even professionals from outside the university sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to hear from the woman who had quietly become a symbol of inspiration. When Sarah walked to the podium, the applause was so loud she froze for a moment. Her eyes widened at the sea of people cheering for her. For a second, she felt that old nervousness creep back, the memory of being the quiet, unnoticed woman in the corner of class. But then she remembered the faces of students she had helped, the ones who had once thought they were hopeless and now believed in themselves. She took a deep breath, steadied her notebook on the podium, and began to speak. And just like before, the room grew silent, every person hanging on her words, as if they were hearing something they had been waiting their whole lives to understand. "Would you like me to continue with how Sarah's influence grows even beyond the university, perhaps leading to an invitation to an international stage?" Sarah's words filled the vast auditorium with a calm confidence that seemed to touch every corner of the room. She spoke with simplicity and warmth, breaking down complex formulas into images everyone could see in their minds. Even those who had once feared mathematics found themselves leaning forward, eager to follow each step. After the session ended, the crowd erupted in applause, and people rushed forward to thank her. Some students told her they finally believed they could pass their exams, while parents shared how their children had come home talking about math with excitement for the first time. Professor Harris stood quietly to the side, watching it all unfold, his earlier pride now replaced with deep respect. He knew Sarah was no longer just a quiet woman with hidden brilliance. She was becoming something far greater, a guide for anyone who had ever been underestimated. Word spread quickly beyond the university walls. An international education committee heard about Sarah's unique teaching style and extended an invitation for her to speak at a global conference. The invitation letter was formal and impressive, but Sarah simply smiled when she read it. She had never dreamed of fame or recognition. All she wanted was to help people see the beauty in learning. Still, she agreed to attend not for herself, but for the chance to reach more people who struggled the way she once had. When she arrived at the conference hall, it was larger than anything she had ever seen. Scholars, educators, and leaders from all over the world had gathered their conversations, filling the space like a low hum of expectation. As Sarah stepped onto the stage, the lights dimmed, and a spotlight fell across her face. For a moment, the memories of being overlooked and doubted flooded her mind. But then she saw the faces in the audience, eyes filled with curiosity and hope. She gripped the edge of the podium and began to speak, her voice steady and gentle, just as it had always been. The room grew silent as she worked through the problem placed before her, turning what had seemed intimidating into something beautifully simple. People who had spent years mastering the subject sat stunned, not by the solution itself, but by the way she made it feel human and alive. When she finished, the hall erupted into thunderous applause, a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Sarah bowed her head, humbled by the moment, and quietly returned to her seat. Yet even as the applause echoed around her, she knew this was only the beginning. Do you want me to continue showing how Sarah's influence begins to inspire young women around the world who had once been told they were not capable? Sarah left the stage with her heart pounding, though her steps were calm and measured. As she walked through the long hallway behind the curtains, she was approached by a group of young women, their eyes bright with admiration. One of them said softly, "We always thought people like us could never belong in places like this, but seeing you here changes everything." Sarah felt a lump in her throat and simply placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, her quiet presence saying more than words could. In the days that followed, articles about her speech filled newspapers and education journals, praising not just her knowledge, but her ability to connect with ordinary people. Messages poured into her inbox from students, teachers, and even parents across the world asking for guidance and encouragement. Sarah, who once thought her voice was too small, now found herself answering those messages late into the night, each reply filled with kindness and sincerity. Professor Harris watched her transformation from afar with both pride and humility, remembering the day he had underestimated her. He visited her one evening and admitted, "I thought I was testing you, but in truth you were the one who tested me and reminded me what it means to truly teach." Sarah smiled gently at his words and invited him to join her in her mission to create spaces where no one felt left behind in learning. Together they began to build programs that encouraged curiosity over competition and respect over ridicule. Sarah's influence spread into small villages where schools had little more than chalk and boards, yet her methods turned even the simplest tools into powerful lessons. Children who once sat silently at the back of classrooms began raising their hands with eagerness, their laughter filling the air as they discovered joy in solving problems. And slowly Sarah's name became known not as a prodigy or a genius, but as a symbol of hope. Her journey carried her from one corner of the world to another, yet she always remained the same quiet woman with a gentle smile and steady voice. Wherever she went, the same thing happened. The doubt in the air gave way to belief, and silence turned into applause. Would you like me to show how Sarah faces new challenges when powerful institutions try to claim her methods for profit instead of purpose? Years passed, and Sarah's quiet journey became a movement that touched countless lives. She had never sought fame, but her name became one spoken with respect in schools, universities, and even communities far away. What made her different was not only her brilliance, but her humility. She never forgot the girl who once sat in silence, afraid to be seen. One day she returned to the same classroom where her story had begun, the chalkboard still scratched with old marks, the seats filled with new eager faces. She stood before them and said gently, "Knowledge is not about showing who is smarter, it is about lifting each other so no one feels small." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with thunderous applause, not out of obligation, but from hearts that truly understood her message. Professor Harris, now retired, sat in the back row with tears in his eyes, proud that the woman he once underestimated had become the teacher the world needed. Sarah looked around at the young faces, smiling with quiet pride. She knew her journey had come full circle. She had proven that genius does not need a stage or a spotlight, it simply needs courage to rise when challenged and kindness to share its light with others. And with that, Sarah closed her notebook, walked down the aisle, and stepped out into the evening sun, ready to keep inspiring the world in her own quiet way.